Have you ever wondered how a single gunshot could plunge the entire world into a war that would redefine history? That's the story of World War I, the Great War, a conflict so massive and brutal it was called the War to End All Wars. It all began in the summer of 1914, but the seeds were planted long before. Europe at the turn of the 20th century was a tangled web of alliances, ambitions, and anxieties. Picture this. On one side you have the Triple Entente, a friendly agreement between France, Britain, and Russia. On the other, the Triple Alliance, a pact binding Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. These weren't just casual handshakes. They were promises. If one country went to war, its allies were obligated to join in. It was like a continent-wide game of dominoes, just waiting for the first piece to fall. Adding fuel to the fire was a fierce sense of nationalism. People across Europe felt immense pride in their countries and were convinced of their own nation's superiority. This pride often spilled over into rivalry, especially between the great powers. Germany, a relatively new but powerful nation, wanted its place in the sun, challenging Britain's naval dominance and France's colonial empire. The Balkans, a region in southeastern Europe, was a particular powder keg, nicknamed the powder keg of Europe for a reason. Different ethnic groups were all vying for independence from the declining Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires. Then came the spark. On June 28, 1914, in the city of Sarajevo, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated. The killer was a young Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip. Austria-Hungary, furious and seeing an opportunity to crush Serbian nationalism once and for all, issued a harsh ultimatum to Serbia. When Serbia couldn't meet every single demand, Austria-Hungary declared war. This is where the dominoes began to topple. Russia, seeing itself as the protector of the Slavic peoples, including the Serbs, began to mobilize its massive army. Germany, allied with Austria-Hungary, saw Russia's mobilization as a direct threat, so Germany declared war on Russia. France, Russia's ally, was next. Germany's war plan, the Schlieffen Plan, involved a lightning-fast strike through neutral Belgium to knock out France before turning to face Russia. But when German troops marched into Belgium, Britain, which had pledged to protect Belgian neutrality, declared war on Germany. Within a few short weeks, the great powers of Europe were at war. Everyone thought it would be over by Christmas. They were tragically wrong. The initial German advance into France was halted, and the conflict bogged down into the grim reality of trench warfare. From the Swiss border to the North Sea, soldiers dug a vast network of trenches. Life in these trenches was horrific. Soldiers faced constant shellfire, machine guns, mud, rats, and disease. The war became a brutal stalemate. Generals on both sides repeatedly ordered massive frontal assaults, sending waves of men over the top into a hail of machine gun fire and artillery shells. Battles like the Somme and Verdun resulted in hundreds of thousands of casualties for just a few miles of gained ground. The scale of the slaughter was unimaginable. The war wasn't just fought in the trenches of the Western Front, it was a global conflict. Battles raged in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and at sea. New technologies made the fighting even more deadly. Poison gas, tanks, airplanes, and submarines were all introduced, changing the face of warfare forever. The U-boat, Germany's submarine, waged a campaign of unrestricted warfare, sinking merchant and passenger ships, which would have major consequences. For years, the war ground on, a meat grinder chewing up a generation of young men. Morale on all sides was plummeting. Russia, battered by military defeats and internal unrest, was the first major power to collapse. The Russian Revolution in 1917 led to the Bolsheviks taking power, and they quickly signed a peace treaty with Germany, pulling Russia out of the war. For the Central Powers, Russia's exit was a huge relief. They could now move all their troops to the Western Front for one final, massive push to win the war before the Americans arrived in force. And why were the Americans coming? A key reason was Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare. The sinking of the British passenger liner Lusitania in 1915, which killed over 100 Americans, had already soured public opinion. The final straw was the Zimmermann telegram, a secret message from Germany to Mexico, proposing an alliance against the United States. Intercepted and published, it outraged the American public. In April 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. America's entry into the war was a decisive turning point. While it took time for American troops to be trained and transported to Europe, their arrival provided a much-needed boost in morale and fresh manpower for the exhausted Allied forces. In the spring of 1918, Germany launched its final gamble, the Spring Offensive. Using new tactics, they smashed through the Allied lines and made huge gains. For a moment, it looked like they might actually win, but the offensive exhausted their best troops and outran their supply lines. The Allies, now reinforced by the Americans, held their ground and then launched a counterattack. This counterattack, known as the 100 Days Offensive, was relentless. The German army, starving, exhausted, and demoralized, began to collapse. At the same time, Germany's allies were falling apart. Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire, and Austria-Hungary all signed armistices. Back in Germany, the people were starving due to the British naval blockade, and revolution was in the air. The German Navy mutinied, and the Kaiser was forced to abdicate. A new German government was formed, and they had no choice but to sue for peace. At the 11th hour, on the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918, the guns finally fell silent. An armistice was signed in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne in France, bringing an end to the fighting. The war was over, but the world was forever changed. Over 16 million people, both soldiers and civilians, were dead. Empires had crumbled, the map of Europe was redrawn. The aftermath led to the Treaty of Versailles, which imposed harsh terms on Germany, creating resentments that would contribute to an even deadlier conflict just 2 decades later. World War I was a tragedy of monumental proportions, a stark reminder of how nationalism, alliances, and a failure of diplomacy can lead to global catastrophe. It reshaped our world in ways we still feel today. Thanks for watching, and if you found this history interesting, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into the events that shaped our world.